So as Jim's pulling this up, first of all, thanks a lot, guys. As we get into this topic, I think I'm preaching to the choir on a lot of the folks that are on the call. So you're going to see some things familiar, but a little bit about me. You'll see it in the second or third slide that we have. It's been about 35 years. I've been a C-suite executive in public and private companies, and I was fortunate enough to be a partner at Deloitte and Accenture. And so my whole life, it's been around organizational change and transformation from a practical sense. So what you're going to see is a lot of what I've done in the background. A little bit about me. I got more degrees than a thermometer. I use very little of them. Most of it's been from practical experience. My approach in transformation is more from a servant leader point of view. You'll see some of that as you go through some of this. I focus on mid-market companies that wanted to really have an incredible bit of what I would call competitive organizational capability. And we'll get into how I do that. And then one of the things that's been really good in my career is I've had the opportunity to work in about 8 different industries. So with that, I have the opportunity to be broad in some respects, but deep in others, okay? So that's just a little bit about me. One unique factor about me that a lot of people on the call may know is I was fortunate enough to go to 4 bowl games when I played for Lou Holtz for NC State way back when. So if you do your chronology check, you'll figure out how old I am. So, and luckily, I didn't have any brain damage from that. To Mark's point, I do not revel in football anymore. If I watch a game, Mark, it's more strategic than from the beer approach. I want to see which team is doing best versus the others from a strategic perspective. So that's a little bit about me. Let's get into the presentation. For lack of when I do these to start with companies, I just try to get them comfortable with, the executive team's comfortable with it, that this is just a practical approach, okay? You're not going to have necessarily a lot of different philosophies, but you are going to have practical application. And it's all around value creation. Everything that you're going to see is what's the practical approach to value creation. So you can go to the next one there, Jim. There you go. So what we're going to talk about today, you've heard the introduction. It's really about on-demand value creation. I want to be real clear on what it is and what it's not, how it works. And then why does it work with lasting results? And then make this a two-way conversation. As we come up with stuff, just, fire out a question and I'll give you the best knowledge that I have in terms of answering the question from experience. And they'll sort of wrap up with some final points that I'll leave you with that are sort of the gist of this whole approach of executive on demand. You'll see there on the bottom, I call it basically my brand is executive on demand. And as an executive, I'll go in as a CEO, COO, an SVP, whatever's the biggest need that they have. But in the negotiating process, make very clear that there are certain things we need to accomplish over the next 12 to 18 months. So that's sort of the conditions by which I go into the operation of helping them have organizational transformation. So if you go to the next one, what is it? So what is it? It's really, there's a lot of words here, but I want to spend a little bit of time on the 5 bullet points. It's really about the whole integration of strategic, operational, and financial capability. And the key words there is capability development. As we're going through the transformation, we're actually developing capability, and you'll see particular examples of that. And it's very straightforward and implementable. It focuses on organizational transformation and competitive capability for sustainable results. And then here's the big part that's a little bit different. I become part of the executive leadership team with joint accountability for execution and results. So it's a little bit different than fractional leadership. You'll see why. And this is one of the major issues that makes it a little bit different. And so there may be a pivot point that the company has, no matter what industry it is. It may be towards an M&A acquisition. It may be towards a divestiture. It may be towards a restructuring. It may be towards the opportunity from going from private to public. It could be a number of different pivot points. And that's the target point by which we then have a controlled way of having focused value creation. So I always start with what is the pivot point? What are the leaders and executives targeting in terms of the major 3 to 5 and sometimes even longer pivot point that they're trying to target. But the big thing about the process that I've found over the years is that it really builds trust through integrity. It's around fact-based decision-making and what I refer to as strong tracks. And you'll see what strong tracks are as we go forward. And it's the tracks that make the train run. And you'll see what those tracks are as we go forward. By the way, stop me at any time as we go through this. So next one, Jim. So what it is not, and this is where I'm always clear when I talk with the executives to start, it's not a quick fix, but if we get some early quick wins, that helps momentum. So we do help on the small quick wins to see that the process is working. It's not a consultant's report done to the team. So I actually don't have a report anywhere. And you're going to scratch your head and say, what? Yeah, there's no report in this process. It's not a threat to existing management because I'm part of the team, you know. So I'm part of the team in terms of the objectives that create so that we're all working on the pivot point together. It's not a fractional executive. A lot of you all are fractional executives, and you'll see this model is a little bit different. But I take certain aspects of being a fractional executive. The difference is I'm there for the long term, and there's not another company that I'm working with most of the time when I do one of these. It's too complicated to do that, and you'll see what I mean. I have been a fractional executive, which actually has helped me to do what I do now in terms of integration. But this is a little different than that. I don't mean to be facetious, Mark. I know you've written a lot of books on the subject of customer experience, but it's really not the latest, book cover. It's really not the latest book cover. It takes a lot of learnings from a lot of different book covers and a lot of different processes. But this process itself is not something that I plan to write a book on. It's not one of those things that's necessarily specialized in one area. So I try to make it to focus on the methodology itself, and kind of pull from a lot of different places that we're all fairly familiar with. And as a matter of fact, Mark, you'll see where customer experience is a very important part of this as we start looking at the due diligence. It's selected initiatives without alignment. It's not that. In other words, the selected initiatives have to be aligned to the business strategy and company goals. And I think everybody on the call knows that, but I think the way we do it is a little different. And then it never ends. It's not a program. So that's what it's not. So this is the model. And you say, well, that looks pretty simple. Well, it is, but it's just hard to do. So if you look at it, it really is to understand and improve the drivers of EBITDA and free cash flow, which optimize value. And so you see these things that are called building blocks. And each one of these building blocks, every company, doesn't matter what industry it is, doesn't matter if it's technology. I've been in 8 different industries. They go from software technology to running a transportation company. They all have these features of what contributes to EBITDA. You have revenue, variable costs, support costs, CapEx. Between variable and support cost, you have this thing called contribution margin. There's something called working capital, management overhead. They all come together to create an EBITDA and then finally a free cash flow. And I think somebody said earlier in the introductions that we had, it is about free cash flow, and now that's available for invested capital. And we'll talk about how that's driven by the what we do with each one of these building blocks and how we integrate them. So that's the model that we start with to start the due diligence evaluation. There it is. All right, so this is the fundamental of the whole effort when I go in as one of these interim executives. There's certain drivers that have to be assessed around strategy, structure, and alignment. And then, what's the why of the business strategy? And really, how's it supported in the marketplace? And it gets into product market placement in the marketplace. So we ask some questions around that I'll get into. And how the financial and operating plans align with that. I'll start there, and you'll see why. Because a lot of times there's companies that have wonderful financial and operating plans, but they have nothing to do with what their strategy should be. It's kind of like doing the wrong thing perfectly, right? So sometimes companies don't even have the right financial and operating plan. So I kind of see where their present state is on their thinking by doing a deep analysis on that. Second thing is, what are the business processes that drive the elements of each of the building blocks that you've seen. There's business processes that are functional, and there's some that are cross-functional. Where are they strong or weak? And then this third point is around the integration of those building blocks. And this is where you'll love it, Mark. Really, the whole purpose is to optimize the customer experience. And how does the contract to cash order management cycle either detract from or contribute to the customer experience? And that third bullet point is oftentimes a revelation to companies, even companies that are well run, because they don't see the connection between their order to cash management cycle and how that's affecting customer experience at every touch point of the company. So we do a pretty in-depth analysis of that. And then most companies have some form of investment case, especially if they're owned by a private equity firm. So nowadays, if they don't have what I would call an investment case, I actually create one for them. But if they have one with the private equity firm, that becomes the basis or the baseline of how we're improving, but in terms of contributing or detracting from the actual results versus plans. So I kind of make sure that I understand exactly where their investment case is, where they're thinking, and where they are thinking that they can make actual versus results efforts. And here's what's really funny about that. Most of the time, the actual versus plan is not reiterated in order to see how well they forecasted, which is a major issue in about 80% of the companies that I've come across. We'll get more to that later. And then what are the management practices? And here's the big one: cultural values that hold everything above together. Are there any gaps? And I'll give you an example of one little company when we go through this, of how the cultural values can really get in the way of setting up what is a consistent system for managing all of this. So those are the major drivers. That's what I focus on when I come in to do the due diligence. So there's 5 aspects of what I call the due diligence checkup. And I don't call it an assessment on purpose. There's a reason I don't call it an assessment. A lot of companies have gotten conditioned to an assessment, thinking that it's not necessarily demonstrative of where the real issues are. So the assessment is done. Issues are done to address the gaps of the assessment, but it really doesn't get down to what I call this concept of capital. And there's 5 aspects of capital. There's cultural and relational capital. Sometimes the culture is just dysfunctional. There's functional and cross-functional capital. You might have a company that has great functional processes, but their cross-functional capability and the handoffs are weak, as an example. And this huge one around marketplace positional capital, and that has everything to do from brand equity to where they've placed their products in the marketplace, and to how that compares against competitors that have maybe a competitive capability that the company I'm working with doesn't have. And then the one that we're most familiar with is financial and equity capital. And then this other one that really pops up in a lot of different ways is knowledge and skills capital. And I'm finding in the 21st century that the rapid change of knowledge and skills capital and what people need to have as things change rapidly is in itself a challenge. How companies can keep up with keeping their employees both knowledgeable and skills capable, especially in a digital society. And we'll get into more about that too. So that's where, when I go in to do the diligence, that I start getting the language with the company to think through this area of capital, because this area of capital in these 5 areas has everything to do to affect with competitive capability that we're trying to produce and value creation. I start with what you're really a much better expert in than I am. And it's around this customer experience analysis. Everything around building value creation on the blocks starts with, how do we build a customer experience where every touch point of the company through the order cash management cycle is looked at very critically. So we start by logically asking the customers. We ask the customers how their experience is. And I'm going to show you something that's going to give you an example of what I come up with every once in a while. Not often is the customer experience from the customer's perspective very close to what the company's perspective of customer experience is. There's a huge gap there. But we have a series of questions. By the way, I didn't say this early on, but I've developed a series of about 130 questions as I go in to do the due diligence checkup that hits all of these different areas, both functionally and cross-functionally. But I really start with customer experience to find out what the major customer blocks are thinking of when they think of this company, and think of it in terms of every touch point that the company has that customer has a chance to touch. All right. Then there's components of existing revenue. A lot of companies have their revenue organized in terms of products and markets, but they don't necessarily know the components of revenue as to how it's contributing in terms of subsets of that. So we kind of do a deep analysis of that. The market share analysis, that's self-evidentiary there, that we look at how they compare with market share and relative market share versus competitors. We'll use every variety of different public information as well as private. If they're private companies that we're competing with, and that's often a challenge in this area, we'll make our best guess. We'll make our best guess with available information that we know about the company. Growth potential, growth strategy. This one's a tricky one. Many companies don't have what I would say is a particular growth strategy based on where they're placed in the market, which you'll see in the next bullet point. This marketing strategy has a lot to do with brand equity and has a lot to do with are the products placed in the right place. And a lot of companies spend a lot of time on what I would call the glitz and glimmer marketing, but not necessarily the marketing in a digital age that's going to allow them to be competitive. And that transformation of how you do marketing is probably one of the largest changes in terms of organizational transformation that a lot of companies are going through, because if you don't have a digital marketing strategy, you're already behind the 8 ball in a significant way. Components of growth and demand generation. This is the old Salesforce management process. How do they generate demand? How do they control the funnel? How do they make sure that the funnel is getting addressed appropriately? You'd be amazed at how many companies, I would say within the 100 to 200 million range, have a pretty good start on anything from Salesforce to any other type of CRM that you want. But as how they follow up on it to make sure that actionable things happen by customer, you'd be amazed how many companies fall down on that. And it actually brings to the next one, which is, do they have the management capability in their sales and product market and variety of other areas to really drive growth? And that goes back to that skills capital that we were talking about. That's often not as strong on the front end as a lot of companies think they are. This is a big one. These last three is a validity of forecast. I have a system that looks at forecast accuracy, and as we start setting up some of the processes, the accountability around forecast accuracy is huge, because if that's off, the rest of the company follows by doing, once again, the wrong thing perfectly. And so not having an accountability to forecast accuracy from forecast to forecast and tying that to performance is usually a pretty large issue that's a gap. Then there's the typical cost of sale to revenue ratio and the win ratio. So that's what we do in the revenue block as an example. And it gets into a lot of, you'll see that how knowing what this is, then you know what it is that we need to transform later and why we start with that block. And then we do a variable cost analysis. And this is the typical things you would think. Now you'd say, gee, this looks like a manufacturing organization. And I would say, yes, it does. But the same principles apply regardless if it's a technology company, if it's a distribution company, if it's a transportation company, it doesn't matter. And it's around product and cost control approaches in the production area, whatever that production area is. Product margin contribution and mix. Many times companies don't really know their product margin contribution, and they'll spend a lot of effort on a low margin product, and they wonder why they're not reaching their EBITDA goals. But they won't let that product go because there's a difficulty in making that decision. So that gets back to fact-based decision making versus, I would say, an affiliation with the product. You know, sometimes the companies get in love with their product so much they can't get rid of it. And then there's this prevention, inspection, and failure cost analysis. This is a real revelation when we do this one. A lot of companies don't know how much cost is in their prevention processes, how much cost is in their inspection processes, and how much is in their failure cost processes. And what I mean by that is they'll spend an inordinate amount of money to do inspection and to prevent failure cost, but it doesn't do the trick because they don't have the cost in the right place in terms of prevention, such as their support cost will be out of whack. Then they wonder why the company's not working well. The fourth one there around throughput and cycle time, this is where we get into time-based competition. Nowadays in the digital technology, if you don't understand how quickly your order to cash management cycle can occur vis-a-vis your competitors, it's a real disadvantage in terms of competitive capability. So we spend a lot of time on this one. In manufacturing and transportation, some of the others, throughput, cycle time, backlog becomes very apparent. When you get to the technology-driven companies, software-driven companies, and a lot of those that are in product development, same principle. I mean, I think one of you all was very involved with software development. You have this same, in a Scrum, you have this same concept of what's the throughput, cycle time, and backlog. And how do you measure that? How do you know it's improving? And then how you know it's improving versus your competitors? That's a big one we spent some time on, because time-based competition is really a key these days to competitive capability. Some factors affecting cost optimization. These are general factors. I'll give you an example of one of those later. And then there's a pretty deep components of cost of goods sold analysis that we did. What are the cost of goods sold components that are driving up or driving down the margin? And that's usually an eye opener, because some of to relate a few thoughts for you, where if you have heavy inspection cost and heavy cost of what I call to make the process work, but not to make the process work for the company, what tends to happen is the cost of goods sold has some of the cost in the wrong places. And then there's capacity and complexity considerations. Went into one company about, I would say about 8 years ago. They actually made, but it's sunscreen and basically skin products. And they had 150 products. And so 150 products in their environment, in their manufacturing facility, was just absolutely out of control. And then we look heavily at cost of sale, which sometimes is out of whack. There was another little company about 4 years ago, and this is going to blow your mind. The cost of sale was higher than their manufacturing cost. They happened to make fire equipment and protection equipment. Now think about that. Their cost of sale was higher than their variable cost to produce the product. And you kind of go, guys, this is not a model that works. So you get into some interesting comments there that you find that are really philosophically wrong. So here's what you can do. This is just an example of one of them, and that's that little company that makes the fire equipment. You can really reduce the COGS per unit, cost of goods sold per unit, if you get a lot of these things going at the same time around throughput, around controlling manufacturing overhead, and then the growth strategy of reducing the complexity of the products. And so we forecasted when we started with this company that they could actually reduce, believe it or not, over a 4-year period, their cost of goods sold per unit by 21% if they were successful in implementing what we recommended. And that became a target of some of the manufacturing people, which was huge. This actually kept them in business. They were actually kept in business as a result of all of these efforts. And then so we come to without going into detail, we give them variable cost conclusions. This is an example. On each one of the building blocks, we give some recommendations of some things that they need to do. And then we create ownership within the organization for people to own these particular type of initiatives as we go. So you won't see a lot of training beforehand. What happens is the training happens as a result of involving the organization in the initiatives they have. We'll give a simple problem solving technique if they don't have that in the company, so they can go off and create ownership on the improvements right off the bat. And this is where some of the small wins come from. So then we go to the same thing with support cost. I won't spend too much time on these, but you'll get the idea. When you get to support cost, these are the fixed cost, where we get some general comments of prevention versus failure. And I'll show you an example of that. And the big one is information technology and business information strategy, moving to digital. Moving to a digital strategy around IT and around business information strategy is just key these days. It's changing so rapidly that one of the things I've recommended in the last several companies is that, do you have a digital transformation strategy for the company in every touch point that you have, as well as your IT support system? Now, that particular question brings out a lot of anxiety because if you don't have somebody that's really well capable in understanding how digital transformation is happening, either as a consultant or on your staff, you're already behind the 8 ball. We talked about marketing and digital strategy, customer care, imagined versus real. I'll show you an example of that. There's such a thing as real customer care. That's the activity that's beneficial to the customer. And then there's the imagined customer care, which is, boy, we sure are busy. I wonder why our customers don't like us. So there's a difference between imagined versus real customer care. The sales support, billing, and order entry process is part of the order to cash. We've talked about that. And this one thing I call quality management maturity. I find a lot of companies that don't know, believe it or not, the difference between big Q and little q. A lot of the little q are around the products and how well they're made, but the big Q is how are the processes integrated so that the overall order to cash is more competitive. And that's more complicated because that's a cross-functional quality where the handoffs between the company has to be owned by the executive team. So what I do right off the bat with the executive team is do the alignment around the vision, mission, value, which you'll see. But one of the first things I do with them is to get the executive team to map the order to cash cycle. And that is an eye opener for them because they start seeing where the gaps are in where what I call quality management maturity, where the cross-functional aspects of the company just don't work well, but the functionals are very well. And sometimes I'll see the functionals and the cross-functionals are not really working well, so that a whole order to cash is working well, and also changing with the times, because that order to cash cycle has changed so rapidly with digital technology and the way people order these days, that if you're not up with the time-based competition of what that does for your company, you really are behind the 8 ball competitively. And then this whole one that we really experience a lot right now, so this last one, supplier management and procurement, you could imagine how difficult that's been with COVID. Supply chains have been totally violated. And a lot of it is they're now realizing that some of the factors of supplier management that they thought were important were not nearly as important in understanding the backlog, the inventory, and the processes that their suppliers have in order to meet certain standards. So we try to introduce standards of supplier management, everything from ISO to you name it, to make sure that we're ready for times like this and when they come up in the future, when we have supply shortages. So those are some of the areas where we're still doing the due diligence. Keep going forward, and I'll give you an example of a cultural thing that gets in the way. Back there you go. On the support costs. So this is a general comment of one of the clients that I had. This client basically had a can-do attitude with its competitors, with its employees, and it was a very good competitive advantage, but there was one fundamental problem with that. They did workarounds. So there was a bunch of workarounds in their manufacturing processes, which is one reason they couldn't fix processes, because the get it done mentality was the organizational resistance to them putting prevention processes in place and streamlining the workflow. So why did that happen? Well, it happened because the executives changed priorities too frequently. The next big thing they wanted to do, and they didn't stick to their guns as to what they wanted to do in their implementation plan. So when you put all of this together, the biggest impediment for them really fixing the processes of the company was their can-do attitude. Kind of ironical, but I imagine a lot of us have seen that in the past. So we had to implement sort of a process excellence, utilizing that positive can-do attitude as an advantage, but then target it to elimination of workarounds and actual fixing the processes for their order to cash process. And then working capital. We spend a lot of time on working capital, part of that financial capability. Here are the things that we look at: product impact, payables management, receivables management, inventory management, and then cash flow from operations. What is the real cash flow that we're contributing to? And then the working capital trends and goals. A lot of companies you would think would look at working capital more religiously, but they really don't. They look at the balance sheet, but not necessarily from a working capital and what their break-even analysis actually is. So there's sometimes training in that, and sometimes understanding the balance sheet a little bit better so that it can be done well. And this is one that gets pretty interesting. That next block was management overhead. Since we've just done all the blocks that contribute to contribution margin, now we start looking at, okay, how's your organization really aligned to your strategy? And the big one is around company beliefs and values. There's many times I'll go into companies and the values are on the wall. This is what we do. And when you do the customer and employee due diligence, it's not how they act. So this is what they profess to do. This is how they act. And that creates a lot of disjointed skepticism among the organization and what they're doing. And so I've tried to focus on that when we get the alignment of the vision, mission, and values in place right off the bat with the executive team. And then this whole area around management system effectiveness. What's the rhythm by which they run the company? How do they make decisions? And a big focus is on the day in the life of the executive and the department leads, present and future. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that when we get down to it. Compensation reward system. One of the key questions I ask is, how do people get rewarded around here? And it's not always around prevention-based performance. One of the companies, this was really a funny one, they got rewarded for being firefighters. Remember that company I told you that made fire protection equipment? Well, they had a firefighter mentality because they would reward the person that created the fire rather than reward the person that prevented the fire from happening. They would reward the person that was the heroic manager who came in with the best workaround. Well, that's just one example that you run into often. And then this whole understanding of the order to cash cycle is huge because that's what holds the whole thing together. If that was not understood well, then usually there's areas of management overhead that are excessive. So you ask the question, well, how do you spend your day? So one of the due diligence questions to get started is, and this is that little company that made firefighting equipment. Well, 47% of their time was, guess what? Fighting fires. They weren't firefighters. That's just, they spent a lot of time in terms of activities that weren't really related to improving the company. And that customer activities one was really responding to firefighting activities that customers came to them on. So Mark, you'll look at this one and then say, oh my goodness, what was their customer experience? Well, it wasn't too good. And a lot of it had to do because of the processes they weren't following in terms of the quality of the product. But you can see the list there. If 47% of your time is firefighting and 53 is around the functional and cross-functional processes, you got a problem. And so that little company had a good time moving them to the next level and getting a good equity partner, actually. All right, so that's one thing that we evaluate with a series of questions that would come in. This whole process, by the way, basically around five, I try to keep it simple. You know, everywhere I ask these 5 questions when I come in: what do we do well? What do we not do well? What should we be doing that we don't do now? What should we stop doing that we're doing now? And here's a major one that just opens up all sorts of cultural questions. Well, how do people get promoted around here anyway? And you'll get a variety of different answers on that that show where the cultural weaknesses are. Remember, I talked about cultural and relational capital. That one is a huge question around discovering what that actually is. And so you come up with something like this, maybe as a starting point. Now, this is the company's perspective, of some of the processes that they have. This is just one example of a company I was working with. And so the percentage at the bottom is their perception of how good it is, right? So they were right on a few things, like their business planning, their IT support, their business development, their business information. They were hurting. That's what was causing their competitive capability to lag their competitors. And they didn't train people well. But look at the bottom. Remember that I talked about customer care? They thought their customer care was the best thing of all their processes. Now I'll ask one question. When we did the customer experience analysis, what do you think their customers said that percentage was? Somebody take a guess.
20%.
Oh, a little higher. It was
bottom 50%.
Yes, 35. It was 35. So their customers said, in customer experience, scale of 1 to 10 with a variety of questions, you're 35%. They thought they were at 100%. You know why they thought they were 100%? Because their definition of customer care was fixing problems after the fact, not preventing them. The whole perception of customer care was flawed. That was part of their culture. Remember, we talked about the culture being a culture of workarounds and not fixing the processes. So this was an entire value system that had to be changed in this company. So we give them a model for planning and execution. Nothing surprising here. Vision, mission, strategies, those are often not aligned. The operating objectives. But the key thing is, you know, what are the most important objectives? Not everything. And that last one is, what's the real link between compensation and the real objectives that are important for driving EBITDA and cash flow? So this is all around EBITDA and cash flow and how it flows up to the process measures that affect it. So we came to some conclusions. Next slide. And oftentimes the conclusions are in this category. I'll give you an example of management overhead. Like you saw on the previous slide, some key business processes need to be improved. Some processes need to be integrated better in order to improve the order to cash cycle, whether it's digitally or some of the things they have in place functionally. And then there's this governance process. I'd say 80 to 90% of the time, I find that the governance process is out of alignment. Okay, now what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. There was a small company about 4 years ago that I was working with, and they had the wrong board. The board expertise that they needed to move forward in the company was not the right one because they were mostly friends. So they weren't specialized in the area to help this company move forward in the processes they need to fix. So they really weren't an effective advisory board. But we couldn't really get that in place until we got the entire team, board included, aligned around those top things. You know, what are the things that we value important around here, and the processes that really need to be improved for value creation to reach our ultimate pivot point goal of whatever the owners wanted to have, whether it was an acquisition, whether it was a divestiture, et cetera. So this last one we recommended in this instance, and this happens often, is what's the alignment of the reward and recognition systems? What's the measurement system to support value creation? What's the whole compensation structure that needs to be looked at for executive leadership? And then how does leadership, how do the executive leadership, as examples, deploy this through their organization so that pay for performance is lined up and they own that? So one of the things that happens in the process is that ownership is created as we start putting the processes in place. I don't really bring in a lot of consultants to do that. I actually help train the organization to do the improvement of the processes that they own. And that clears up a lot of the things that are in people's performance objectives that were not necessarily there before. All right, so just some recommendations and next steps. Here's how it's brought all together. So at the end of the day, how's it brought together? A little thing that I call VMOST, just the alignment of the vision, mission, objectives, strategy, and tactics. This is the organizational strategy and structure alignment start, and then how does that look? And then you've seen how the building blocks are addressed and the order management cycles addressed. Really spend a lot of time coaching on the day in the life of the leaders. If the day in the life of the leaders is not changing to show the people that report to them in the company that things are different and they're using their time differently, it doesn't happen. It flat out doesn't happen. So I spend a lot of time coaching on how their day in the life changes. Obvious things around the management performance system. And what we come out with after the end of that 4 months or 5 months period is the execution plan for the next 3 years. But we also come out with a 5-year rolling financial forecast, including the P&L balance sheet and EBITDA and cash flow, with the assumptions that we've made on the things we're going to improve. And that key thing that I brought up earlier is the ability to make sure that as we go along the way, either on a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis, that we're comparing the actual forecasts to the forecasts that were made previously to make sure our forecasting accuracy is important. Because I found in a lot of instances, if the forecasting accuracy is off, it really does mess up how the company is addressing customer experience. And then the training and empowerment of problem solving is along the way. There's no particular program for this. We just literally, as they're involved in the initiatives that be improved, we introduce a simple problem solving technique if they don't have it, so they can do something fairly fast and effective. So I'm going to leave you with a few final takeaways, and then I'll open it up for questions. What are the takeaways when, let's say after about 18 months to 24 months, and sometimes 3 years, I leave and I'm no longer there? Well, here's what I'm hoping is going to happen. The organization is going to understand its capacity for organizational change. Some organizations can change rapidly, some don't, for the variety of the factors that we just talked about. It really requires patience and compassion. When you're going through one of these transformations, you really do have to be compassionate. It's about creating a focused and flexible and adaptable organization. The most important aspect of the organizational characteristic is ability to adapt to change, because change is so rapidly happening nowadays. Not reverting because the transformation is difficult. Sometimes they want to revert. I'll say no, stick to the plan. And then this critical one, the understanding of the order management cycle by the executive team, their buy-in to how they're owning the improvement of that, and their commitment to the plan is key. If there's one wavering that you have in that executive team, hopefully you hope that executive team is going to put pressure on that person. And sometimes an executive team member needs to self-select. In doing this for like 25, 30 years, I've only released 3 people from their responsibilities because they wouldn't adapt to the change. 2 of them self-selected. Let that sink in a little bit. If they get buy-in correctly with the collective team, it's amazing what happens if the entire team sticks with it. If you create some positive momentum with some immediate results, no matter how big or small they are. Creating a fun ownership and reward in the organization. You say, well, those look like 3 contradictory terms. No, they're not. So try to create a whole exercise of fun and rewarding people for the improvement of efforts in the company and celebrating it, and really doing some celebrations around that. And then the final thing I'll leave with them, and I said, the leaders in a servant leader capacity, we really work for the success of the people. We don't work for ourselves. We actually work for the success of the people. And that's usually a huge transformation in itself, because if that last attitude is taken, the whole focus of organizational transformation changes. It's not something that you do to the people. It's something that you're exemplary for the people. And that's how we hopefully have the takeaways that matter. So let me stop there. Probably went a little longer than I thought, but see if there's any questions or maybe any additional comments that you all see that I would be welcome to listen to, because I've tried to be a person of lifelong learning, so I don't necessarily have the right answer, but there's a lot of people smarter than me that often do.
I have one. Darryl, do you use any kind of assessments, for example, DISC or any of the other ones, Lencioni's 5 behaviors, to assess the leadership or assess the current executive team?
Yeah, and I'm selective on which ones I've done, because I've done DISC and several others through my career. Mm-hmm. And after I do the analysis on that cultural capital, I try to figure out which one might be the best one for this particular company. Oftentimes DISC is, it is. Sometimes they've already done those assessments, but then they don't know what to do with them. They're okay, this is great. Now what do I do? There's many of them that are applicable to the particular issues that the company has. So I don't say that I hone in on one of them, but I do it if it's needed. Had one company, they had a great DISC analysis of each of their executives, and it was on the shelf somewhere. Mm-hmm. They said, well, this was nice, but so they didn't integrate it into how they needed to change as an organization to understand their executive team and the department managers from where they sat, what was their natural tendencies.
Right. Lencioni has the book out that's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
Yeah.
I've worked on a lot of leadership teams, and it's about the leadership team getting along with each other.
Absolutely.
Not in silos. So there is a tool out there that DISC has. It's called, and if you want to talk about it, I can talk about it separately because I'm actually certified in it, but it's called 5 Behaviors. And you do, it's the triangle that Lencioni has, and you do it every quarter or every 6 months. And the team gets together and says, okay, we're very low on trust. What are we going to do to fix this? Or very low on communication, or we're high in this area. What are we going to do to keep that being a strength? And so the team can assess themselves and look at it individually on a regular basis. So you know that you're moving the needle in the right direction. Yeah, great point. Great point. Yeah, there's a couple of those sort of what I would call cultural reality checks that you're talking about. The one that you mentioned is really good, the 5 aspects of cultural change. There's another one
There's a lot of different ones, but yeah, I'd love to talk to you about it, because one of the things we leave with is the executive team's ownership of holding each other accountable on the values. So let me show you the approach that we do. Remember I mentioned that the values were so important?
Yeah.
And so if those values are the most important thing, I set up a very simple technique, 1 to 10, of them evaluating each other, both confidentially and individually, on how are we doing on each of those values. So one might be trust. Another one might be, well, you know, you hear this one all the time, we're quality minded. Well, what does that mean? Does your behavior exhibit how well you respond internally in the organization to requests that come to you? So we have a number of things that really tie to the values that come back as a checkpoint. So to your point, when it comes down to behavior, a subset of that would be, what's the behavior that's driving somebody that's either supporting the values from the executive team position or not?
Right.
Right? But that's one way that we do it, on a very simple way. If they want to get into more detailed accountability to each other on the behavioral aspects, you know, the behavioral aspects are interesting, to your point. But one of the things I've found is that, how do you really view, where's your real core beliefs about the potential that you see in others and the potential that you see in yourself? And I don't want to get too religious on everybody, but what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you don't have a genuine love for people, this is not going to go well.
Right. Exactly. And the second question I had for Joe is kind of similar to that, but how do you deal with executive teams or leadership teams that may have other family members?
Oh,
Dynamics between, you know, as you're talking about going through this process, it may have not actually been the cadence in the past to really have the tools and the methodologies that you have in place. And now the family may not, there may be family members in positions that aren't fully skilled or capable in those particular areas.
great question. I've come across it about 3 or 4 times, where the family member that was family member got in the way of progress. 2 of those times, it was well, actually, it's more than that. It's probably about 4 times. 2 of those times, it was the CEO himself, and he was mature enough to step aside and say, I'll be the chairman of the board, get out of the way. And could you please put in the system that we need to have to make this successful? Because I'd like to sell this thing in about 5 years. I had one CEO that would not get out of the way. And I said, after 4 months, thank you very much. When you're ready to come back and make a change in how this is affecting the way the company is working, let me know. He never called me back. And the company was sold at a valuation that was not to his advantage.
Yep.
Another one had 2 sons that were in department manager positions that the CEO, who was actually a good CEO, was trying to groom. All right. To your point, they didn't have the skill sets. So I tried something for about 3 months. One of them was, let's see if they can adopt to the skill sets and manage within the system. One of them did. One of them did not. So I had to challenge the CEO. I said, okay, this son over here seems to be exemplifying what you want to have as your successor. And here's the succession plan for him, because he's willing to make the change on learning these sorts of things to do better. Mm-hmm. The other one did not. And so I basically said to the CEO, what do you want to do? It took him about 3 months to come to the realization that he had to tell the second son, look, if you want to be involved in the company, I have a place over here for you. And be mindful of the fact, when we sell this company, you're not going to necessarily get the amount that your brother's going to get as a result of the contribution he will have made. Mm-hmm. That was a tough message.
I bet.
But to your point, it happens a lot. I had one company, like I mentioned, the CEO wouldn't step aside. I had another company that the worst, maybe the worst department manager in the entire company was the son of the owner. And everybody in the company knew it. And eventually the CEO made the hard decision. He asked his son to go do something else outside the company and he would help fund it, but he couldn't be in the company. So the CEO helped set up his son in another business. It was so apparent to the whole organization that the CEO had to make a decision. These are delicate navigation points to your question, but they have to be addressed. And you know, I try to do it in a way of tough love as much as I possibly can. I'm cordial and I try to be as straightforward as I am, but I try to present these things in as much of a care for the organization as I possibly can. These are tough decisions. I mean, they're heart-rendering to some of these owners. Heart-rendering, and you got to be, you got to give them some grace. You got to be understanding that you got to give them time to go through that. But you can't give them too much time because the clock's ticking against your competitors, right? So, great question, by the way.
Good. Thank you, Darryl.
Happens all the time.
Yeah.
Darryl, as part of your responsibility when you're working with a client to leave them with a system that they can improve their management style on their own, and because this whole process looks like a template for an integrated management system.
It is. As a matter of fact, that's a major part of it. When you saw in the management overhead section, I tried to equate whether the management overhead is effective, efficient, or if it's in a ratio that's cost related to the revenue like it should be. All right. That being said, remember I talked about there's soundtracks at the start. There's some soundtracks that you leave. And one of the soundtracks, if not the most important one, is this management system of how they run the company and get into a rhythm. What do they review weekly? What do they review monthly? How do they hold themselves accountable quarterly? How do they target what they're doing and make sure that the accountability for the entire team is there? So there's team accountability as well as personal accountability. That whole management system of work is sort of put into place, Jim, as we go. So after I leave, they have a completely different management system than they had when they started. And they're running it. They're running it. But it's around honest accountability. It's around the right metrics. But more importantly, it's around accountability in the management system that everybody's going to be responsible for improving the processes from where they sit. That nobody abstains from that responsibility. And so when you set that management system in place and get a rhythm, it's probably one of the most important things that you leave for them to be successful. What I do often is I'll go back a couple years later and ask them how they're doing. You know, I'll give them some time here. I've been doing this for a while. And I'd say about 80 to 90% of the time, they're still doing the process. I had one of them that they said, well, you know, we got into year one or two of that, and then it was too hard. What do you think happened to their value creation? It went down. It went down. It went down significantly. I mean, they did sell the company, but they sold it at about 40% of what their original intent was 3 years prior. Okay, they went back. They reverted. Remember, I said if it gets too difficult, don't revert. They reverted. They didn't put the management system in place. The results were obvious.
Absolutely. What other questions do we have for Darryl today?
Jim, not a question, but a comment. Darryl, I've heard all those words before, but there's something about the way you put them together that hit different this time. And I think the canary in the coal mine that I'm seeing is that I think you called it forecast integrity.
Yeah.
I used to work at the Dysfunctional company. You may know them from your previous engagements. And 330 days on the sales pipeline is not an opportunity.
Right.
Right. it's just a lie.
It's a
And
lot.
it's just a lie that you tell yourself to make the pipeline look better. But I really, just some things that I've experienced recently came into a lot clearer focus in the way you put that together. So I really appreciate the way that you presented that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Chris. It's, you know, I'm not saying it's necessarily the absolute right way, but it's worked for me with way God's blessed me with a lot of the different experiences I've had. And it really is, you know, it really comes down to a desire to make others successful and hanging there with it. You know, it's a subtle point. It's a subtle point, but a lot of these transformations are gut wrenching. So even though you're doing all the tactical stuff, you have to really be mindful of where these decision makers are, because it's their company, right? I've even seen this same sort of affection when I've worked with public companies. You would say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, it does. Because a lot of the people that were CEOs in those public companies were there for 35 years or 30 years or whatever the case may be. And they love the company. You're asking them to change the company they love.
Yeah.
And
It's tough to do surgery on yourself.
It's hard to do surgery on yourself. And you got to be honest with them, but you have to treat it with integrity. You know, when I go in, I have to show my integrity on this, right? I'm not going to ask them to do anything that, as an executive, myself is not willing to do. So I'm on that team, and I have the same accountability factors as they do, but I'm also their coach. I'm coaching them along from wherever I sit.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
But to your point, I appreciate that. I appreciate the comment.
Any other questions for Darryl? Going once? Going twice? Darryl, this is fabulous. This is really an excellent presentation, and I'm looking forward to editing down our time today and putting this on the website. And that'll be something that you can link to and help market your business.
That'd be great.
Not sure how much bandwidth you have at the moment, but at some point in the future, I mean, it's probably going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
So
just real quick, you know, behind me, I'm surprised somebody didn't ask the question. What's that behind me? You see this thing right here?
yeah, that's your presentation on a chart, right?
That's the presentation on a chart. That's a transformational chart of outcomes that we expect at this church that I'm working with for the next 5 to 6 years. So if you look at it, the values are on the left, the phases are on the right, going across the top. And then there's elements of things that have to happen that are outcomes that get us to the transformational change. That's one thing that I do when I come into companies and I leave it up. So if you want to come look at it, you can. I purposely don't put it in a notebook. I leave it visual somewhere.
Terrific.
Because guess what? That thing can change. Year 3, something else might be an outcome that you didn't expect.
Right.
So everybody owns it.
So how much longer are you working on that project?
It probably about another 1.5 years.
Is that right?
Seriously.
Wow. So you're going to write a book afterwards?
Yeah, but I don't want it to become a fad. You know, I just want to think about this. And there's a lot of books out there that, to Chris's point, there's a lot of books out here that hit a lot of these points. I've been wrestling with how can I bring this simply together and then leave soundtracks, right? I don't want to write a book that doesn't leave soundtracks.
Right.
And when I say sound, I don't mean like what you hear. You know what I mean? Tracks that somebody can run on.
Well, you know, I spent a lot of time working with companies that are a little bit beyond startup and going into rapid growth.
Yeah.
And, you know, the sad thing in many cases is they don't have this kind of a foundation to go forward. You know, they just don't know what they don't know in many cases. But that really, you know, can be the difference between success and failure.
Well said. Well said.
Thanks again. Have a great weekend. Darryl, a special thanks, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.